and I haven't changed.
Amen.
I must confess, before I begin, I'd like to have a personal word with my regional minister. I've carried a load for 47 years, and I have to confess it tonight, or this afternoon. Yes, I was the contractor, the general contractor for the building. By the way, the steeple was struck multiple times, not just. When we got ready to mark the property to stake out the base of the church, we discovered, much to our dismay, that it was not going to work in that place. We knew that there was a 12-inch tile drain that drained the farmland north of 63rd, that came under 63rd and south, and where we had planted the church, it was going to be over that tile drain, and we did not want that to break and cause serious issues with the congregation. So the architect and I moved the whole building 4 feet closer to 63rd Street. And I must confess, Dr. D.A. Parker, I've carried this burden for 47 years. Even the city didn't know that we did that. That's okay. There's a little, I was looking at the history of the congregation. We didn't buy the land on which the church now stands, the building. Mr. Black wouldn't sell that 10 acres to us. We went down on Main Street where the current city park is and bought him another 10 acres where he moved, and he donated the land that the church is now on to the church. By the way, the house that he lived in, which is no longer there, was a stagecoach stop from the Hinsdale. They came out, they stopped at Hinsdale, then went on to Aurora somewhere. And it was a very old house. It was built in the early 1800s. And contrary to what you may have heard in the worship service this morning, that was not an old rickety barn. We gave serious thought to refinishing that barn and using it as our building. It was a substantial structure. That was a pinned barn, hand-hewn beams, and it was only 1 inch out of square. It was remarkable. The only reason we didn't do it was because of cost. We were told by a specialist in the field that as soon as we enclosed it, because it was a pinned barn, once we turned on the heat and over a couple of seasons, the wood pins would shrink and fall out, so we'd have to brace all the beams in the barn before we could move in. If you don't believe me, ask Carl Mysick. We were laughing about it today. Carol Turk he worked for a construction company, brought out one of his backhoes. We tried to knock down the machine shed back there. We hit that thing, I don't know how many times with that backhoe, and it still stood there.
I remember that.
See?
I also remember the fire.
Well, we're not going to go into that. I only have 10 minutes and I've shot 5 of them already, so. In one of her emails regarding today's celebration, Terry observed that it must be quite profound for me to see something that I started 50 years ago and it's still around, and that I am a witness to this half-century of ministry. While it is humbling to see that Downers Grove has prospered these many years, I am glad, more than you can imagine, to still be here to celebrate with you. I did stop at the Toon Funeral Home this morning to check the parking lot, because the north parking lot when I came here, that was the house I went to where Al and Susie Boynton lived and interviewed to come out here, and they called me that evening. The house is no longer there, it's at the Toon lot, so I was looking for the plaque, but I couldn't find it. And so obviously it must be in for repair somewhere. I'll find it some other time. As I look back over these 50 years, particularly the 8 years I was here, the temptation is to talk about some of the funny things that happened. For example, one Easter Sunday, a new couple said to me as I welcomed them to our worship service, "Hi, I'm Rip Van Winkle, and this is my lovely wife Gladys." As they made their way to the pew, Charlie Hobbs, who'd been standing there and heard that, leaned over and whispered in my ear, "And I'm Santa Claus, too." What a way to begin an Easter service. We were still meeting at O'Neill Junior High School when I stumbled on a way to get the undivided attention of the teenagers in Sunday school class. We met in the gym and the kids sat in the bleachers. It was always hard to get things started because someone was always shooting the basketballs. I usually sat in a chair on the gym floor. One Sunday, the shooting of basketballs and conversations had gone on too long. So I asked for a ball and said that if I could make a basket with my back to the rim, they would have to listen to what I had to say. And if I missed, they could talk all they wanted. Well, they agreed to that because they thought they were going to get the gap for the rest of the half hour. I took the ball, carefully looked back at the rim behind me, turned and faced them, shot the ball over my head, swish. Someone, it might have been Carl Isaac or Charlie Long, one of the two, said, "I bet you can't make that again." I took another ball. Swish again. I had their undivided attention for the rest of that session. Fortunately, I was never asked to do that again. It's hard to imagine now, but in the heady days of planting churches in the 60s, the Church Federation of Chicago plotted the entire metro area and surrounding counties with denominational dots, each representing a new church site. To plant a disciple congregation in Downers required a trade with the Presbyterians and one of their sites, so we switched and we took a Presbyterian site. The deal was struck, and here we are 50 years later. From the very beginning, we believed we were called to be a faith community that stood close to our community and its people. We vowed that our worship service would be different, in that we would not be so highly organized as the congregations we grew up in. We would experiment with various forms of worship. We began the practice of deacons coming to the front of the sanctuary during the singing of the hymn of preparation. In those days, most congregations observed the tradition of deacons processing in and sitting down front from the beginning of the service to the end of the service. A dress code was the usual practice: dark suit and white shirt. I say white shirt because women didn't serve communion in those days. They were deaconesses. They prepared communion and cleaned up after worship. From the very first service at First Methodist Church, we practiced open membership, and women served as deacons and elders. That was very new in the mid-60s. A psychotherapist college classmate of mine made an observation that even in the faith community, in the church, we have to give permission to talk about and share those things that trouble us. About 4 years into our work, a couple joined, and he came to me after he was asked to be a deacon. He painfully shared that he couldn't serve since he was an alcoholic. I assured him that God welcomes all of us into worship and service in spite of our faults. I tried to assure him that if God used only the perfect, there would be precious few laborers in the vineyard. Not only did he serve as deacon, I asked him to share his painful journey with the adult Sunday school class. Much to my surprise, it wasn't long after his Sunday school confession that I started receiving invitations from other members of the congregation to attend open AA meetings and Al-Anon meetings. We experienced a level of trust in those early years that I have not seen in very many faith communities during my 57 years of ministry. Yes, we began this ministry in the 60s when the Vietnam War was at its most controversial and the Civil Rights Movement had arrived in Chicago. All of our institutions were being called into question. Anger was the operative word of those days. For example, I received threatening phone calls after it appeared in the local papers that I had just returned from Washington, D.C., where I and others had lobbied for passage of a strong civil rights bill. Like many cities in our nation in that era, there were those here and downers who worried about the African Americans, they were called blacks then, moving into the community. And in addition, they might even be asking to join the church. What were we going to do? Even though some may have had reservations, First Christian made it very clear that all of God's children were welcome here. We taught and believed God commanded this welcome through the voice of the prophet Isaiah. My house shall be a house of prayer for all people. To my knowledge, we did not have anyone leave the congregation because of these heated issues, which were headlined in the news almost every day. Some may have decided not to join, but those who did became a part of a brightening beacon in those dark times. It may have been safer to avoid these issues, but we were committed to being a faithful community, no matter the cost. Through all of our work, we were not hesitant to confront the principalities and powers, as St. Paul called them when he wrote the churches in his care. The experience of the ancient people of Israel and the struggles of the first century church became a lamp that illumined our journey in those troubled days. 2 weeks before the capital campaign for the building, Carol Turk, chair of the campaign, called to say he had been transferred to Indiana and would be gone in a week. We were devastated. One of our newest members, Robert Edmonds, upon hearing this, volunteered to fill the gap. We hardly knew him, but had no other choice since no one else stepped forward. The successful campaign was a humbling lesson that taught us to trust the work of the Holy Spirit. Later, we observed that Carol Turk was the one person who could and did prepare us to climb the mountain of this campaign. And we learned it was Bob Edmonds who had the skills to make it all work. By the way, that building cost $80,000. I'm reminded of that fact, of God's work in our midst, and the variety of the human family every time I see the paintings of the contemporary artist C.W. Connor. I met C.W. when I served as interim pastor at Cherry Log Christian Church in Cherry Log, Georgia, some 7 years ago. C.W. was a member there. He grew up in Appalachia. He loved the simple life and was a house painter by profession. His idea of celebrating New Year's Eve was to return to the mountains to watch a possum drop at the stroke of midnight. None of that crystal ball stuff, Times Square for him. When he retired, he took up the painting of religious stories he had heard all of his life. His paintings are done on old pieces of wood. Patty and I were gifted with his painting of a baptism. All of his religious scenes show the participants looking upward from whatever they are doing, while the viewer is looking down on the scene. Looking up at you are the faithful, and they are all black. In CW's pictures, you are invited into the scene. The viewer becomes a part of the action captured in paint and wood. But his pictures are not about the participants or those who are viewing the scenes as painted. Rather, they are a reminder that no matter the color in all that we say and do in the life of faith, all of it comes from God. God is the one who formed us. God is the one who called us into service, and it is God who journeys with us through life. God is colorblind. That has been, and hopefully continues to be, the mantra of First Christian Church Downers Grove. God is the one who formed you, who called you into service, and who journeys with you through your life. What a 50 years of ministry. Patty and I are looking forward to watching the next 50 years, either from here or from above. It is our joy to share with you in those early years. You welcomed our children into the world and sent us forth on our family journey. We have not, nor will we ever forget you. Blessing to all the saints of Downers, past, present, and future.